The rain hammered against the windows of our Upper West Side apartment all night, a relentless drumming that mirrored the unease in my own heart. Water streamed down the glass, distorting the city lights into blurry streaks, and in those wavering reflections, I kept seeing his face, Ethan's face. That same quiet, guarded expression he always wore, even though Ethan was gone, had been gone for months. I remembered the last time I saw him, standing in the doorway of this very apartment, suitcase in hand, eyes darting between me and the hallway as if he couldn't decide whether to stay or run. He'd mumbled something about needing space, needing to clear his head, a break from everything, words that hung heavy with unspoken meaning. But vanish? Completely? My husband, Richard, a man of logic, of courtroom battles and concrete evidence, couldn't grasp it. In his world, people didn't just evaporate. Either Ethan was hiding something or something terrible had happened to him. The idea that Ethan might have simply chosen to disappear without a word was incomprehensible to Richard. But I knew Ethan better, or at least I thought I did. I knew the tangled thoughts that plagued him, the way he felt suffocated by the life he was living, yearning for something else, something he couldn't quite reach. He confided in me, at least partially, but there were depths he kept hidden, things I sensed rather than knew. And then there was Lisa, his girlfriend. I saw the suspicion in her eyes the day she came here, her gaze sharp, scanning our living room as if searching for clues, for evidence of what? Me? She thought I didn't notice, but I felt the tension between us, thick as the city smog on a summer morning. She had questions Richard and I couldn't answer, questions I was afraid to even consider. Now, the silence in the apartment was a presence, filling every room, every corner. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening, expecting to hear his footsteps on the stairs, his voice calling my name, but there was only the rain and the endless whisper of memories clinging to the walls, reminders of things better left buried. I'm not proud of everything I've done, but regret? Regret is for people who can afford to look back without flinching. For those of us living in the shadows, each choice is a stone thrown into a dark well, the ripples vanishing, but the weight remains. And the weight had become crushing. So here I was, waiting in this apartment, wondering if the rain would ever stop, or if I was destined to be trapped in this storm, haunted by the face in the window and the secrets I couldn't outrun. Richard and I met under circumstances some might call fate, though I was starting to believe fate was just a cruel trickster. I was 49, freshly divorced, worn down from years of a marriage that had become an empty shell. Richard, a respected attorney, seemed like a solid anchor, charming in that understated way that hinted at a sharp mind. When he proposed, I said yes, eager to close the door on the past and start anew. Ethan, though, was a different story. I first met him at Richard's Long Island house one Sunday in early spring. He was sitting on the porch steps, shoulders hunched, as if shielding himself from a non-existent chill. There was a quietness about him, a restraint I noticed immediately. At 23, he had the look of someone who'd seen too much, too young, a darkness in his eyes that made him seem older than his years. He offered a handshake, formal and polite, though his fingers were ice cold. I didn't know then that this first encounter would set the tone for everything that followed. There was always a distance between us, a chasm I couldn't quite bridge, and for a long time I assumed Ethan simply resented my presence, an intruder in his life. Richard rarely spoke of him, beyond brief comments about Ethan's moods, how they never quite saw eye to eye. Ethan moved into the guest house on the property soon after Richard and I married. He'd come back from college, talking about focusing on his writing, ambitions Richard viewed with a mix of skepticism and indifference. To Richard, a career had to be tangible, something with prestige, purpose. Writing, he'd say, was a nice hobby, but it wouldn't pay the bills. He pushed Ethan towards law school, a suggestion Ethan met with silence, a look that spoke volumes. I tried to mediate, to bridge the gap between them, but my efforts only seemed to push Ethan further away. He'd join us for dinner occasionally, sitting at the table, eyes downcast, barely touching his food. Richard would hold court, his voice booming as he recounted courtroom victories, and Ethan would nod, his gaze drifting to the window, longing to be anywhere else. It was during one of these dinners that I saw a crack in his armor, a flicker of something raw and unguarded. Richard had just finished a story about a client who'd walked free after months of legal maneuvering, leaning back in his chair, a smug smile on his face. "That's why I do what I do," he'd declared. "Justice. It's all about strategy." Ethan looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a fleeting electric moment. I saw the disillusionment there, the frustration simmering beneath the surface. It was a look that said he felt trapped, caged by expectations. I held his gaze, offering a subtle nod, and something passed between us then, an understanding neither of us spoke aloud, but both understood. Months blurred into a series of quiet dinners, strained conversations, and Richard's frequent absences. His workload was relentless, long hours at the office, business trips that left me alone in the echoing house with my thoughts. I filled the silence with work, throwing myself into my real estate business, but my mind would drift, wandering to the guest house, to the young man living there. Ethan and I started talking more. Small pleasantries at first, gradually deepening into something more. I'd find him in the garden, hands deep in the soil, tending a small patch of herbs and flowers he'd planted. He told me it was something he'd started in college, a way to clear his head, to focus, though he'd never felt the need to explain it to anyone else before. I listened, drawn to the quiet intensity in his voice, the way he seemed to find meaning in things others overlooked. One evening I brought him tea as he sat on the porch, a book open on his lap. He looked up, surprised, accepting the cup with a faint smile. "Thanks," he murmured, his voice soft. I sat beside him. The silence stretched between us, comfortable yet charged. We talked about books, about the dreams he'd once held, the realities that had crept in to replace them. He admitted he often felt adrift, unsure of his direction, and I found myself nodding, understanding his restlessness far more than I cared to admit. As weeks turned into months, our conversations lengthened, and I sensed a shift, a tension that lingered in the air between us. A subtle glance held too long, a brush of fingers as I handed him a cup. I told myself it was harmless, that I was simply offering companionship he clearly lacked, but deep down, I knew it was more. It was early summer, during one of Richard's longer trips, when everything shifted. I went to the guest house to drop off a package that had arrived for Ethan. He answered the door, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. I stepped inside, intending to leave the package and go, but something held me there. He looked at me, a question in his gaze, and I felt a pull, an ache I hadn't realized was building. We didn't speak of it afterward, didn't acknowledge the shift that had occurred, but there was no denying things had changed. The weight of what we'd done settled over us like a heavy fog, but instead of pushing us apart, it seemed to bind us closer. We became cautious, careful to avoid Richard's notice, yet there was an undeniable thrill in the secrecy, a thrill that both terrified and exhilarated me. But as much as we tried to keep things hidden, there were signs, small, almost imperceptible details others might miss, but I knew could betray us. I could feel Lisa's eyes on us, her gaze sharp, probing. She'd grown closer to Ethan over the past months, and I sensed her suspicions growing, a slow burn beneath the surface. She was protective of him, wary of anyone who might hurt him, and I knew if she ever found out about us, she wouldn't stay silent. I tried to maintain distance to keep things casual when Lisa was around, but there were moments my guard slipped. A look, a gesture, a casual touch. It was impossible to completely hide the connection that had grown between us, and Lisa, perceptive as she was, began to notice. One evening, she pulled me aside, her tone polite, but her words laced with accusation. "Is everything okay between you and Ethan?" she asked, her eyes narrowing as she studied my face. I forced a smile, keeping my voice calm. "Of course, Lisa, why wouldn't it be?" Her gaze lingered, a challenge in her eyes. "I don't know," she said slowly, as if testing my reaction. "He just seems different lately. I wanted to make sure everything was all right." I offered a reassuring nod, hiding the tremor that had started in my hands. "Ethan's been under a lot of pressure," I replied, hoping to deflect her suspicions. "But he's fine. We're all fine." But as she walked away, I knew the facade I'd so carefully constructed was starting to crack. Lisa was no fool, and the more she watched, the more she'd see. And so, a new tension settled over me, a dread that gnawed at the edges of my mind, whispering that our secret wouldn't stay buried forever. After that summer night, a part of me hoped things would return to normal. I thought if I acted as if nothing had happened, maybe Ethan and I could go back to the way we were before. But the closeness we shared was like a spark, one that had flared bright and wouldn't be extinguished so easily. Every stolen glance, every accidental touch felt charged with the memory of that evening, a memory that lingered between us like an unsaid confession. It wasn't long before I found myself drifting back to the guest house, often under the guise of delivering something or asking for his help with some trivial task. There was always a reason, a flimsy excuse to knock on his door. The guest house became a refuge, a world apart from Richard's presence and from the prying eyes of anyone who might question our time together. Most days we'd simply talk, Our conversations, a patchwork of dreams, frustrations, musings, neither of us felt free to share with anyone else. Ethan had always been complex, and I was drawn to the depth of his thoughts, the way he saw the world with a mix of fascination and skepticism. He told me about the characters he was creating for his writing, about the struggle to make them feel real. I listened, captivated, feeling as though I were glimpsing a part of him he hid from everyone else. One evening, as autumn leaves began to fall, we sat on the porch of the guest house, sipping tea and watching the light fade. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of earth and decaying leaves, and I felt a shiver run down my spine, though it wasn't from the cold. Ethan looked at me, his gaze soft but intense, as if seeing me for the first time. "You've been a good friend to me, Carol," he said quietly. "More than I deserve, maybe." I shook my head, surprised by his words. "Why would you say that?" He looked down, his fingers tracing patterns on the edge of his cup. "I don't know. Sometimes I feel like I'm just drifting, like I don't belong here, or anywhere." I reached out, placing a hand over his. "You belong, Ethan. You're finding your way, just like everyone else." Our hands lingered, neither of us pulling away, and for a brief moment the world felt impossibly still. His fingers closed around mine, gentle but firm, and I felt a warmth rise in my chest, a warmth as terrifying as it was exhilarating. We sat like that for a long time, neither of us speaking, simply existing in each other's presence. And though we didn't acknowledge it, we both knew something irreversible had taken root, something that wouldn't be easily forgotten or ignored. In the weeks that followed, our connection deepened, becoming an unspoken truth we carried in the quiet moments when we were alone. We developed a careful rhythm, meeting in secluded parts of the property or in the guest house when Richard was away. Each encounter was a mix of anticipation and dread, a thrill tempered by the knowledge we were walking a dangerous line. Richard, oblivious as ever, remained preoccupied with his work. He'd taken on a high-profile case that demanded long hours, and his frequent absences became the backdrop against which Ethan and I's relationship flourished. I told myself we weren't hurting anyone, that our connection was something beyond the ordinary, something neither of us had chosen, but simply fallen into. But in the back of my mind, I knew the truth. Secrets, no matter how well kept, have a way of surfacing. Lisa, however, was far from oblivious. Her visits to the house became more frequent, her watchful gaze sharper each time. I noticed the way she looked at me, the way her eyes lingered on Ethan whenever he spoke to me. She was no longer content to let things lie, and I could feel her suspicions growing, as tangible as a storm gathering on the horizon. One afternoon, while Richard was away on a business trip, I found myself in the guest house, helping Ethan organize some old papers he'd kept in a storage box. We laughed over childhood mementos he'd unearthed, his face softening in a way that made my heart ache. I felt myself drawn to him, the warmth of his presence filling the room. But as we talked, I heard a sound, a faint, almost imperceptible creak outside. I froze, my pulse quickening, and Ethan's face went pale as he glanced towards the door. We both knew that sound all too well, the unmistakable creak of the steps leading up to the porch. Lisa stood there, her eyes narrowed as she took in the scene before her. She said nothing, but I could see the wheels turning in her mind, piecing together the fragments of a story she'd suspected for some time. "Am I interrupting something?" she asked, her tone deceptively calm. I forced a smile, trying to mask the panic that had seized me. "Not at all, Lisa. Ethan was just showing me some old things he found." She glanced at him, her gaze icy. "Old things?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. Ethan shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware of the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. "It's nothing, Lisa," he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. She looked from him to me, her expression hardening. "I'm sure," she replied, a hint of warning in her tone, "but I'd appreciate it if you'd leave him alone." Her words hit me like a blow, a stark reminder of the line I'd crossed, the boundary I'd stepped over without fully understanding the consequences. I nodded, unable to find the words to respond, and left the guest house, my heart pounding, Lisa's gaze burning into my back. After that encounter, things became tense between Ethan and me. We grew more cautious, careful to avoid even the appearance of closeness, but the tension between us only grew stronger, a silent force pulling us together despite the risks. Lisa, however, was far from satisfied. Her suspicion had turned into something darker, something that felt like a threat lurking just beneath the surface. She began asking questions, subtle at first, but growing bolder over time. I could feel her watching, waiting for a slip, a mistake that would confirm her worst fears. One evening, she confronted me directly, catching me as I was leaving the guest house after dropping off a book Ethan had asked to borrow. "Do you think I'm stupid, Carol?" she asked, her voice low and edged with anger. I turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lisa." She stepped closer, her gaze piercing. "I see the way you look at him. I'm not blind, Carol. You think you can just sweep in here and play whatever game you're playing, but I won't let you hurt him." The accusation in her words was unmistakable, and for a moment I felt a flicker of shame, but I quickly suppressed it, holding my ground. "I care about Ethan," I said evenly, "and I would never hurt him." She scoffed, crossing her arms, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "Is that what you tell yourself, that this is harmless?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You're playing with fire, Carol, and people get burned." Her words lingered in my mind long after she left, a warning that echoed through my thoughts like a dark promise. But no matter how much I tried to distance myself, to put space between Ethan and me, I couldn't break free from the bond we'd forged. The secrecy, the danger, it only made our connection stronger, drawing us closer even as it pushed us further into the shadows. As winter approached, the tension reached a boiling point. Every encounter with Lisa felt like a battle of wills, a silent standoff in which neither of us was willing to back down. She watched me with an intensity that bordered on obsession, her eyes filled with a fierce protectiveness that I knew would only end in confrontation. Yet I couldn't walk away from Ethan, couldn't sever the connection that had become as vital to me as air. The guest house became our sanctuary, a place where we could be ourselves, without the weight of judgment or the expectations of others. In those stolen moments, we were free, unburdened by the world outside. But freedom, I soon realized, is a fragile thing, a luxury that comes at a price. And as the days grew colder, I felt the storm brewing around us, a storm that I knew would shatter the delicate balance we'd created. Lisa's suspicions were no longer just suspicions, they were a threat, a force that would soon demand answers I wasn't ready to give. In the end, it wasn't a question of if things would come crashing down, but when, and as much as I tried to prepare myself, to brace for the inevitable, I knew some storms cannot be weathered, they can only be survived if one is lucky enough to make it through to the other side. The days after that confrontation with Lisa felt like walking on shattered glass. Every conversation, every look she gave me seemed sharpened, a pointed reminder she was watching. My nights became restless. I'd lie awake, listening to the quiet creaks and groans of the old house, convinced each sound was someone creeping down the hall, ready to expose my secret. Even Richard seemed to pick up on the tension, casting occasional puzzled glances in my direction, though he never directly questioned me. I'd become accustomed to the silence, to carefully maintaining a mask of calm, but Lisa was something else entirely. She was relentless, hovering on the edges of our life, a constant presence I couldn't escape. She came by the house almost every day, often finding reasons to pull Ethan away for long, whispered conversations. I couldn't hear what they discussed, but I could see the frustration building in Ethan, his posture tense, his words clipped whenever he finally returned. The worst part was the doubt. I'd begun to wonder if perhaps Lisa was right to be suspicious, if I had allowed myself to cross lines I could never uncross. Yet even as these thoughts plagued me, I found myself drawn back to Ethan, helpless against the pull he exerted over me. We'd managed to keep things hidden so far, but I knew with Lisa around, the walls were closing in fast. One evening, as I was putting away dishes after dinner, Lisa appeared in the doorway, her expression unreadable. She looked at me for a long moment, and I could feel the weight of her scrutiny pressing down on me. "I need to talk to you," she said, her tone steely. I set the dish towel down, my hands trembling slightly. "What is it?" She closed the distance between us, her eyes narrowing. "Whatever game you think you're playing, it ends now. I won't let you hurt him." A coldness settled in my chest, but I kept my voice steady. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lisa." "Oh, don't play dumb with me," she snapped, her voice low but fierce. "I see what's going on here. I see the way you look at him, the way you act around him. You think I haven't noticed? That everyone hasn't noticed?" Her words struck like a slap, but I forced myself to keep my composure. "You're being paranoid, Lisa. Ethan is my stepson. Nothing more." She scoffed, a bitter smile twisting her lips. "You can tell yourself that all you want, but you can't fool me. I've seen the way he looks at you too. I've heard the things he won't say." I took a deep breath, struggling to keep my voice calm. "Lisa, I care about Ethan. He's been through a lot, and I'm trying to be there for him, that's all." She shook her head, her expression filled with a strange mixture of pity and disgust. If you really cared about him, you'd stay away. He doesn't need this, whatever this is. She paused, her voice softening just a little. He deserves better than to be caught up in your mess. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me standing alone in the kitchen, the chill of her words lingering in the air. For the first time, I felt the full weight of what I'd done, the impact of the choices I'd made. Lisa was right. Ethan deserved better. But it was too late to change things now. I'd crossed too many lines and there was no going back. After that, things grew worse. I felt Lisa's eyes on me at every turn, her presence a constant reminder of the secrets I carried. Ethan, too, seemed to grow distant, pulled in two directions by forces he couldn't reconcile. I tried to reach him, to bridge the gap widening between us, but he was slipping further away with each passing day. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, the tension finally broke. I heard voices coming from outside, hushed but intense, and I moved to the window, peering out into the dark. There, by the guest house, I saw them, Ethan and Lisa, standing close together, their faces partially obscured by shadows. They were arguing, their voices barely audible, but I could sense the anger, the frustration, the desperation in their tones. I pressed a hand to my mouth, my heart pounding as I watched them, feeling like an intruder in my own life. Suddenly, Lisa turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing alone in the darkness. He watched her go, his posture slumped, his face etched with a pain that cut through me like a knife. I wanted to go to him, to comfort him, to tell him everything would be okay, but I knew it was a lie. Nothing was okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. In the days that followed, Ethan became more withdrawn, avoiding both Lisa and me. He spent hours locked away in the guest house, only emerging when he thought no one would see him. I tried to reach out, to bridge the growing distance, but he brushed me off, his words curt and distant. The strain took its toll on me. I could feel myself unraveling, my mind consumed by thoughts of Ethan, of Lisa, of the secrets that threatened to destroy everything I'd built. I became paranoid, jumping at every sound, convinced Lisa was watching, waiting for the moment she could finally expose me. Then, one night, Ethan disappeared. It was a cold, rainy evening, and Richard was delayed at work, leaving me alone in the apartment. I waited, hoping Ethan would come inside, that he would talk to me, finally tell me what was going on in his mind. But as hours dragged on, there was no sign of him. At first, I assumed he'd gone out, maybe to clear his head, but as the night wore on, a nagging worry crept into my thoughts. I went to the guest house, knocking on the door but no answer. I opened the door, stepping inside, but the place was empty, eerily still. I checked his room, his desk, the small stack of books by his bed. Everything was in its place, untouched, as if he'd simply stepped out for a moment. But his phone was there, abandoned on the nightstand, and a chill ran down my spine. Ethan never went anywhere without his phone. Panic set in as I searched the property, calling his name into the empty night. My voice echoed back, swallowed by the darkness, and a sickening realization began to take hold. Ethan was gone. By the time Richard came home, I was frantic, my mind racing with possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Richard tried to calm me, insisting Ethan would turn up, that he was probably just blowing off steam. But I knew better. Ethan hadn't just left. He'd vanished, leaving behind nothing but faint traces of a life interrupted. Lisa came by the next morning, her face pale, her eyes wide with worry. She claimed she hadn't seen him, but I could see the suspicion in her gaze, the unspoken accusation hanging between us. Days turned into weeks, and still no sign of him. The police were called. A search was conducted, but nothing turned up. It was as if Ethan had been swallowed by the earth, leaving behind only questions and a hollow ache that grew with each passing day. I could feel Richard's eyes on me, the doubt in his gaze growing with every unanswered question. He began asking about the time I spent with Ethan, the conversations we'd had, the things we'd shared. I tried to keep my answers vague, to avoid giving him any reason to dig deeper, but I sensed his suspicion mounting. And Lisa's presence became a haunting shadow, a constant reminder of the secrets buried beneath the surface. She was relentless, her accusations growing bolder, her words laced with venom. She claimed to know things, to have seen things, and I began to wonder if perhaps she did. Her anger was like a flame, consuming everything in its path, leaving me defenseless against the weight of my own guilt. The police questioned me too, their voices calm, but their eyes sharp, probing for cracks in my story. I kept my answers measured, careful to reveal nothing, but inside I was falling apart. The paranoia, the fear, the guilt, it was all too much, a weight pressing down on me, suffocating me in silence. Everywhere I looked, I saw ghosts, remnants of a life unraveled in the blink of an eye. The apartment felt empty, hollow, a shell holding only memories of things I'd lost. And in the quiet moments, alone with my thoughts, I could still feel Ethan's presence, a shadow lingering in the corners of my mind, haunting me with the knowledge of what I'd done. As days stretched into months, I realized Ethan's disappearance wasn't just a tragedy, it was a reckoning, a reminder some secrets are too heavy to carry, that truth has a way of surfacing no matter how deeply buried. And so I waited, trapped in the web of my own making, haunted by the memory of a face I could no longer see but could never forget. Because in the end, the past catches up with us all, and I knew, deep down, my time was running out. The day Detective Harding arrived, the New York sky was a somber gray, casting the apartment in a dim, muted light, deepening every shadow. I stood by the window, watching him step out of his unmarked car, a tall, lean figure with a deliberate gait. He wore a dark trench coat, his expression unreadable as he approached the building, his eyes taking in every detail, every crack and crevice, as if he could divine secrets from the very walls. Richard greeted him at the door, his voice tense but composed. I lingered in the hallway, uncertain, my pulse quickening as their voices drew near. When Richard called me over to meet Detective Harding, I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Mrs. Sterling," the detective said, extending a hand with a polite nod, his gaze sharp, assessing, the kind of look that seemed to see far more than it let on. "Detective," I replied, shaking his hand. His grip was firm, his expression calm, but there was an intensity in his eyes that unsettled me. He gestured to the living room, taking a seat in an armchair, pulling out a small notebook. "Thank you for meeting with me," he said, his tone professional. "I know this is a difficult time, but I'd like to ask a few questions about Ethan's disappearance." "Of course," I replied, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands. I sat across from him, folding my hands in my lap, forcing myself to appear calm. Richard sat beside me, his face pale, his jaw clenched. Detective Harding glanced between us, his gaze lingering on me before he began. "From what we've gathered, Ethan was last seen here at the apartment," he said, flipping through his notes. "Can you tell me about the last time you saw him?" I hesitated, my mind racing, recalling that night, the memory hazy, fractured by worry and guilt. "It was a few days before he disappeared," I said slowly. "He seemed troubled, distracted. He mentioned needing some space, some time to clear his head." Harding nodded, his pen scratching across the page. "And did he mention where he was planning to go?" "No," I replied, shaking my head. "He didn't say anything specific, just that he needed to get away for a while." He looked up, studying my face, thoughtful. "Did he often leave without telling you where he was going?" I glanced at Richard, sensing his tension. "Not often, no, but he'd been going through a rough time lately. He was unhappy." I chose my words carefully, not wanting to reveal too much, though I could feel Harding's eyes probing for deception. Harding jotted down notes before glancing back up. Unhappy in what way? Did he have issues with anyone in the family, perhaps? Richard shifted uncomfortably, his mouth tightening. "Ethan and I had our differences," he admitted, his voice edged with frustration. "He's always been a bit lost, you might say. I tried to guide him, but he was stubborn, set in his ways, always focused on his writing, never willing to consider anything more practical." I could feel Richard's resentment, the unspoken disappointment coloring his relationship with Ethan. Harding seemed to sense it too, his gaze lingering on Richard before turning back to me. "And you, Mrs. Sterling?" he asked, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. "What was your relationship with Ethan like?" The question caught me off guard, and I struggled to keep my expression neutral. We got along well," I said, carefully choosing my words. "I cared about him. I wanted him to feel at home here." Harding watched me closely, his gaze unwavering. "And did he feel at home, or did he feel out of place?" The question struck a nerve, and a pang of guilt twisted in my chest. "He struggled sometimes," I admitted. "I think he felt caught between expectations, between what he wanted and what others wanted for him." Harding nodded, thoughtful. "And was there anyone in particular who put pressure on him? A friend, perhaps, or a girlfriend?" Lisa's face flashed in my mind, her sharp gaze, her cutting words. I hesitated. "Yes," I said finally. "Lisa Graham. She and Ethan were close. She'd been around a lot lately, especially before he disappeared." Harding jotted down the name. "And did you get along with Lisa?" I swallowed, feeling the weight of his question. "We had our differences. She was very protective of Ethan." He glanced up, his eyes meeting mine. Protective in what way? I hesitated, searching for the right words. She worried about him. She thought I was too close to him, that I was interfering in his life. Harding raised an eyebrow, his pen hovering over the page. Interfering how? I could feel Richard's eyes on me, his gaze sharp, and I struggled to maintain composure. She felt I was overstepping, but I only wanted to help him, to support him. Harding studied me for a long moment. I see, he said finally, jotting more notes. And was Ethan aware of her concerns? I nodded, feeling the tension in my chest tighten. Yes, he was caught in the middle, I think. He didn't want to hurt anyone. The detective's pen scratched across the page, the sound filling the silence as he continued questioning. He asked about routines, interactions, every small detail of the days leading up to Ethan's disappearance. I answered as best I could, careful not to reveal too much, though I could feel his scrutiny pressing down, the weight of his gaze like a spotlight exposing every flaw, every crack in my story. As the questioning continued, dread settled over me, a creeping realization he was piecing together the truth, or some version of it. He asked about my relationship with Richard, the time I spent at the guest house, arguments with Lisa. Each question felt like a trap, a subtle attempt to lure me into revealing more. Finally, after what felt like hours, Harding closed his notebook, his gaze lingering on me. He rose from his seat. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Sterling," he said, his tone polite but eyes sharp. "If I have further questions, I'll be in touch." I forced a smile, nodding as I stood to see him out. As he turned to leave, a thought struck me, a question nagging at the edge of my mind. "Detective," I said, my voice wavering slightly, Do you think Ethan is all right?" He paused, glancing back, a look both sympathetic and guarded. "We're doing everything we can to find him, Mrs. Sterling. But as you might imagine, there are complications when someone disappears. There are always unanswered questions." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Richard watched him leave, his expression dark, his jaw clenched. He turned to me. "Is there something you're not telling me, Carol?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion. I shook my head, forcing myself to stay calm. "Of course not, Richard. I told him everything I know." But even as I said it, I felt the walls closing in, the weight of my secrets pressing down. Lisa's accusations, Ethan's disappearance, the detective's probing questions, it was too much, a storm of guilt and fear threatening to consume me. In the days that followed, Harding's presence became a fixture. His visits more frequent, his questions more pointed. He spoke to Richard, Lisa, anyone who might have known Ethan, piecing together a picture that felt increasingly dangerous, as though he were unraveling threads of a tapestry I tried so hard to keep intact. Each time he returned, his questions grew sharper, his gaze more intense. He asked about every interaction, every word, every glance that might hint at something more between Ethan and me. I could feel him closing in, circling the truth with patience both terrifying and relentless. Lisa, too, became bolder, her accusations no longer veiled. She confronted me openly, her words sharp, her gaze filled with hatred. "You did this," she hissed one evening, her voice trembling with fury. "You drove him away. You took him from me." I tried to deny it, to tell her I was as lost as she was, but the words felt hollow. She saw through me, her eyes blazing with grief that cut like a blade. "I don't know where he is, Lisa," I said, my voice breaking. "I don't know what happened to him." But even as I spoke, I felt the weight of my own guilt, the knowledge I'd played a part, my actions setting these events in motion. As Lisa turned away, her face twisted with anger and despair, I realized the truth was no longer something I could keep hidden. Detective Harding continued his questioning, each visit a reminder of secrets I carried, choices I'd made, price I'd pay. He spoke to neighbors, friends, anyone who might have seen or heard something, piecing together a portrait of a life unraveling, a family torn apart by lies and betrayal. All the while, my guilt grew heavier, a burden I could no longer bear. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's face, sadness I couldn't erase, reminder of the life I'd destroyed. As the investigation dragged on, I wondered if the truth would surface, secrets exposed, consequences faced. Though I feared it, a part of me longed for release, end to the endless nightmare. Because in the end, some secrets can't be buried, some truths can't be hidden. As I watched Detective Harding leave, his gaze lingering with unsaid things, I knew my time was running out.